In the first video in this series, we talked about how there seems to be a lot of allegory in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, lots of correspondences with the life of Christ. But as it turns out, C.S. Lewis really did not like the term allegory being applied to his work. And so in this video, I'm going to talk about why that is. What's the explanation for his opposition to this term? Let's start here with a quotation, and he says here, "Some people seem to think that I began Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe by asking myself how I could say something about Christianity to children. Then fixed on the fairy tale as an instrument, then collected information about child psychology, right, like how to manipulate children, and decided what age group I would write for, then drew up a list of basic Christian truths and hammered out allegories to embody them." And he says, this is all moonshine. This is all nonsense. I couldn't write in that way at all. Everything began with images, right? Nothing Christian about them at first. And then he says at the end, that element, that Christian element, pushed itself in of its own accord. It was part of the bubbling up. So everything bubbles up from the bottom. And that movement from the bottom is something we'll come back to as we go through this. Now, this is just one passage I could quote. There are lots more, particularly in C.S. Lewis's letters to children, which make for fascinating reading. Kids are constantly asking him, what's the meaning? And he says, well, it does have a Christian meaning ultimately, but it's not allegory. So why does he say this? Well, part of this has to do with his definition of allegory. And as I go through this, I'll give you three major reasons. But the first reason is that for C.S. Lewis, allegory is quite artificial and abstract. Why does he say this? Well, if you read his work, The Allegory of Love, which is his scholarly work on medieval allegory, if you look particularly at pages 44 to 48 or so, he defines allegory as follows. So we have the term allegory. And he says what happens with allegory is that you start with an idea, okay, a concept, and then you seek to embody that in some kind of object. Let me give an example of what this means in practice. So let's say you have the idea of anger that you want to illustrate. You really want to give a strong message about anger and maybe how to avoid it. And maybe even want, the opposite, patience. Those two tend to go together. So then you need to illustrate this, and you can have some, really angry character here. So maybe let's just draw an angry kind of, there we go, angry kind of character here. Doesn't look super angry. Looks a bit odd, but you get the point. And if this is, we'll make him a little bit bigger here, and we'll have some, there we go, some steam coming out of his ears. Maybe that's a bit better. Let's give him a Latin name. So in Latin, this would be the figure of ira, anger. We've personified him, and now we can say, okay, this is allegory, right? This figure shows what anger really is in real life. He probably throws weapons, spear at you. He has all kinds of attributes. The problem for C.S. Lewis here is that the movement is entirely from the idea to the object. You come up with the lesson first, and then you give the example. For C.S. Lewis, this is different from what happens with symbolism. Symbolism. All right, so with symbolism, we start with the object, and then the object naturally leads to the meaning. There we go. Let me give an example here. Let's say that you take a dove, okay, a dove, and you say, well, what is the meaning of a dove? And you could say, well, it represents peace. You wouldn't take a lion, for instance, as representing peace. So it makes sense then that a dove is a natural symbol, right? The object itself gives you the meaning. And what you can see here then is that the movement is entirely in the opposite direction. So with allegory, what's most important is the idea. This is what you start with. That's what you want to illustrate. But with symbolism, it's the object that is equally important or very important here. And if you compare this with Christianity, the way Christianity works, you can see why C.S. Lewis prefers symbolism to allegory. Because if you take, for instance, the bread and the wine as part of the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist, then you say, okay, well, what does that mean? And you say, okay, this refers to Christ, right? Christ's body and blood. And these are natural symbols then. So C.S. Lewis connects symbolism to what he calls sacramentalism. And there's almost a kind of justification here that symbolism is better, it's more natural, because it ties in so well with this Christian element. In the next video, we'll talk a lot about whether that's a good reason or not. I think there are some issues with it, but I want you just to see at this point where he's coming from. Why does he think that allegory is artificial and abstract, whereas symbolism is more natural? All right, so in our first point, we looked at C.S. Lewis's basic opposition to allegory, and I want to flesh this out now in our second and third points by looking especially at what C.S. Lewis wanted to replace allegory with. So this is a bit more of a positive perspective. What was he actually trying to do then in telling the story of Narnia? He referred to this as a suppositional approach. Let's see what he meant by that. And if you take the expression suppose that, okay, so let's start with this. Suppose that, ... then if you imagine another world, you would say, well, suppose that there is another world, like Narnia, another world, and suppose that there is a lion in that world, a lion who happens to be able to talk, and we will call him Aslan. Well, maybe in that world we start to have a story that develops, and maybe in that story there is wrongdoing. In this case, Edmund comes in and he is guilty of certain things, and he needs to be punished according to the White Witch, another character that we have introduced here. Well, if that's the case, then there may be need for redemption, right? We actually need some kind of redemption. And if you look at what has happened here, we've started with the object. If you think of symbolism, we started with a very natural story. Okay, so these are just objects, you might say. And then pretty gradually, we've actually got to some kind of lesson, some kind of meaning. And these meanings just happen to be Christian. But for C.S. Lewis, these meanings are natural. Okay, they are natural. You can find them in almost any world. You can imagine almost any other world, but you'll still get to these same basic truths, these same basic kinds of lessons. That is what C.S. Lewis means by a suppositional approach. It's not allegory, it's not from the top down, it's quite the opposite. You start telling a story, and naturally out of that flow these kind of lessons which are universal and which are in harmony also with Christianity. That brings us to the third point here, which is really connected to this. And this has to do with C.S. Lewis's view of universal values. So what we are seeing then is that he likes to start with nature. Okay, he likes to start with nature. And from there, he gets us to universal values. I'm just going to abbreviate this to UV. All right. And he calls this in another work the Tao or the Tao, using an Eastern word. If you read The Abolition of Man, very famous work by C.S. Lewis, he talks about how in many cultures across the globe you have these universal values, things like, don't steal, don't hurt people needlessly, and the list goes on. Okay, so if we have these universal values that are part of nature, if truth is part of nature, then what we can say is that we don't really need allegory, because again, allegory or the lessons come bubbling up from the bottom. Do you remember that term bubbling that he used in that quotation? Right? It always starts with the object. It starts with nature. It starts with things that are all around us. And from there, we naturally get to these larger lessons. In the book, in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, he refers to this as deep magic. Deep magic. And this magic happens to be inscribed, okay, happens to be inscribed on the stone table. So I'll just draw sort of a stone table here. Looks a bit like Stonehenge maybe. But for C.S. Lewis, the stone table represents the natural law that you can find in the entire world, in the entire universe. It's common to all peoples. And it's precisely this natural law that allows the witch to say, okay, Edmund, you've done something wrong. There needs to be a punishment here, right? So this then leads to Aslan's sacrifice. There has to be redemption. Somebody has to save Edmund. And what we can see then is that sacrifice is natural. It's a natural outcome. Okay. In other words, all of this progression is natural. We don't need allegory for this. We can simply start with a story, and eventually we will get to this kind of lesson anyways. The lesson is inevitable. You don't need to start with it. It's going to happen by itself. So that basically sums up why C.S. Lewis doesn't think that allegory is necessary. Gives us kind of 3 reasons here. They're all interconnected, as you can see. In the next video then, we'll talk about if there are any objections to this viewpoint. Are there any weaknesses to C.S. Lewis's argument? And I think there are quite a few potentially, but it will be up to you to decide if you think the objections have merit.